Hey folks, this is the history of retirement, or what the heck is ERISA? So I had a lot of fun making this presentation. I originally gave it to a group of my colleagues. I got a lot of great feedback. I was really pleased with that. I had a ton of fun making it. So now I have expanded it and I have put it online. So this is part 1 of 5. I have broken it up to make it go a little easier. So just a quick overview, we are going to understand the history of retirement in order to understand ERISA a little bit better. So ERISA, the Employee Retirement Income Security Act, it's very intimidating to a lot of people. Obviously, it's a U.S. law. It's from 1974. It has taxes. It has all sorts of complex rules. It requires, in some places, actuarial training. It is very dense, and even among experts, it has a reputation for being very dry, very opaque, and difficult to understand. But I don't think that's the case. I think that it actually pulls back to a lot of very basic principles, and we can sort of understand what's going on. We can understand why it exists. So that's the goal with this video, is to focus on some key issues throughout history. And by looking at those case studies, those little instances, little corners of history, we can see what matters in retirement. And by seeing what matters, we can understand why ERISA exists, or at least what it's trying to accomplish. So we will look at those key issues. We'll look through case studies and we'll try to spot some of the key issues that are coming up. And then those key issues will help us maybe not be so intimidated by ERISA. So we're going to go through a lot of legal history. We're going to go through war pensions. We're going to cover modern retirement history. We'll go through the structure of ERISA, and then we'll talk about current trends in retirement. So just a little overview of the different videos. Part 1, this video, is war pensions, and we're going to go back to the Roman Empire and through Bacon's rebellion in the 17th century in North America. Future videos, Part 2 is also war pensions. It will pick back up with the American Revolution and the Continental Army through World War I and the Bonus Army, and a little bit after that into World War II pensions. Then Part 3 will cover the rise of private pensions, which is its own separate history. It takes off a little bit overlap, but later than a lot of the war pensions. Part 4, we will cover the structure of ERISA and some of the specific concepts. And then in Part 5, we'll talk more about the current status and the shift to defined contribution and some of the current issues affecting retirement. So these are the key issues that I have identified. They are not by any means the only ways to look at it. There's no formal or academic backing to it. These are the things that I find interesting and useful and things that I wanted to draw out. So I've divided them into these 5 groups that are just important questions I think that we should ask. And I've also color-coded them, as you can see, because that makes it a little simpler for me to draw a string, draw a thread through all of the same trends that we're seeing, the same key issues over time. So the first one is the purpose, and I've given it the little target symbol and I've made it red, and it's why the benefit even exists. In some cases, this might seem very simple, very basic. Why am I even asking? In other cases, it might seem very complex, like, oh, that's so thorny. Why are we even trying to confront such a difficult issue that's so distracting? So let's just sort of take it as it lies. Let's not try to make it too simple and let's not make it too complex, but it's an important question. What is our motivation? What is this pension or retirement, or what is this arrangement even trying to achieve? And that'll help us understand a lot of the structure of the various retirement forms that we'll be looking at. So for administration, I've made it this gold color and given it a nice little piece of paper, even though obviously that nice little typed page is not going to be what we'll see back in ancient Rome, for example. But how do you even claim the benefits? If you are entitled to a retirement or a pension or anything else under one of these arrangements, what does that look like to you as a participant? How do you get it? Who do you talk to? What do you need to prove? This is actually a very important issue. It seems very dry. It seems very nuts and bolts, but it will come through, and we will see why ERISA exists, more importantly. So the question of vesting seems very dry. I've given it the green color and I've made it the lock, and that lock is really important. Vesting says that it's yours. You own it, and that really means it's enforceable. If you can enforce it, then in a very real sense, you own it. So if you can't enforce it, do you even own it? But if you can enforce it, then it is meaningful. That is yours. You can protect it against someone trying to take it away. We're going to look at this. This is a very key issue. It often seems very dry. It's very, very important. Then we'll move to the funding, which I've given this teal color and a little $sign. I guess it would have been a little too obvious for me to make the money green, but I wanted to be different. But funding is very important. Who's even paying for this? And how does the method of payment and the parties paying affect all of the other aspects of the pension or the retirement scheme? The payer has a lot of control. What is the payer doing with that control? How does that influence all of the other aspects? How does that influence vesting and administration and so forth? And more importantly, what does that say about purpose? And then we'll get to fairness. Very, very simple issue. I've given it this nice royal purple and the scales of justice symbol. And who gets the benefits, and more importantly, who doesn't get the benefits? How do we balance, or how does the system balance between different participants in the system, or between, say, widows or orphans and current beneficiaries? Who gets the benefits? Who doesn't? This is just the most essential question. Who even gets it? Do we think that that's fair? So again, we're going to spot all of these issues as we go through the entire video. So just try and keep an eye out. It will be very obvious. I will draw attention to them. But again, got the nice color coding, so you have no excuse for getting lost. So this is an overview of the war pensions part of the presentation. Part 1 is going to cover only a portion of it, but we will go back to Antiquity and soldier pensions for Rome. Both we'll start with the Republic, and then the Roman Empire is where we'll focus. Then we'll move on to colonial and British pensions in the 17th and 18th centuries. Then in part 2, we will go to Revolutionary War pensions, then the Civil War, and we'll spend some time with the World War I bonus march, and then a little bit finishing up with World War II and the GI Bill of Rights. So this is a very high-level explanation of Roman pensions. And again, I am no expert in Roman pensions. I'm an expert in modern pensions, taxes, ERISA, etc. I am not a Roman historian. This is my understanding, and it really will help draw these contrasts. I understand we're going way back in history. Why do I need to go back 2,000 years to explain a law from 1974? Well, you'll see. Just follow along. So the Roman Republic early on, it was really the Roman citizens served in the army, then went back to their occupations. So you might know the fable of Cincinnatus, which often comes up in stories of George Washington, which the idea was that Cincinnatus served when the Republic needed him, when Rome needed him, and then as soon as it was over, instead of taking power for himself, he went back to his farm. And the same was said of George Washington. He was drawn to the same idea. So very, very civic focus on it. Well, as Rome had a lot of martial demands, they really needed a military. They got a lot of professionalization. It stopped becoming a thing that you did for a short period to serve the Republic, and it became a thing that was just your job. It was your occupation. The Roman soldiers then wanted to be paid with what was functionally a retirement, settling in the colonies or colonia of these conquered lands, which gave the soldiers a direct interest in actually more conquests, but it also gave them loyalty to Rome as a republic, Rome as an idea, Rome as a political institution. That was where their land came from, that was where their wealth was tied, that was who gave them the land that they lived on, the land that they were benefiting from, even if they didn't live there. These land-based pensions really pushed Rome to satisfy soldiers. They needed to conquer more territory. It also had a lot of resentment that came up from the Roman elites who otherwise would have been able to use the land in these colonies. that instead went to soldiers. And there's definitely sort of a class issue going on there. You could be an elite, a patrician, you could be very high-born, you could have a lot of history, but some person who's just a soldier, he served in the Legion, he could get land that you might feel belonged to you. So there was definitely some tension in paying functionally a retirement pension in the form of land. So now we switch to the Roman Empire and Augustus, who implemented a monetary grant to replace the land distribution. So again, this is no longer the Roman Republic. This is after Caesar. This is the Roman Empire. And this cash distribution, it would replace land so that they no longer had to take land from the elites. They no longer had to conquer constantly more territory. They could redistribute cash instead of redistributing land. So for example, a legionary might serve 20 years and then get a lump sum equal to 12 years of pay. Over the course of the Roman Empire, obviously the numbers were moving a lot and it was not always stable. Different positions, different ranks might get different levels of service or different levels of lump sum, but you could use that lump sum to buy land for yourself. So you would buy your retirement. You could buy a farm or buy anything else that you needed to take care of yourself in your old age. So it served a lot of the same purposes of incentivizing people to choose the Legion as their profession, but also buying their loyalty to Rome so that they wouldn't support, say, a coup for your opponent. So a lot of political angles in there. Theoretically, there was a dedicated trust fund. Theoretically, that trust fund was supported by taxes, but this was very uneasy throughout the entire period of this Roman Arium military, which was not very stable. There were problems where people didn't want to contribute. It initially began with essentially voluntary contributions that were partially funded by the emperor himself out of his own wealth. So it just really, it sounded good in theory, but it was not as stable as you would have expected, and often that led to funding problems for the empire. So let's look at those key issues. So purpose, why would this benefit exist? Well, we've talked about it already, but obviously recruitment, and that's going to be a common theme. Recruitment encourages people to pick soldiering as an occupation. So it's not just a temporary civic duty. You don't do it because you're a citizen. You don't do it out of the goodness of your heart. You don't do it because you love war. You do it because it's a job, and it's a hard job. It's a dangerous job, so you need to be paid. They need to incentivize you, especially if it hurts your body, if it leaves you too sick to do any work later, or if it takes away so much of your time that you're not able to accumulate money in some other profession. So they really needed to pay people to be legionaries. And then obviously there's a political angle, which would be that a soldier who has been paid for his retirement is not going to likely support a coup. So you're buying their loyalty against your opponents. So funding, how did you pay for this benefit? Well, I mean, as we discussed, it was a nice trust in theory. The tax system, theoretically funding the trust would have been nice, but it was never very well set up. From the beginning, they did not think clearly about how money would go in, how it would be kept, and how it would be paid out. And that just led to problems throughout, that it was unreliable and it would go up and down with the whims of each administration and each administrator. And then vesting, was this really enforceable? Could the legionaries support it other than through a coup? No, not really, not always. It would be essentially an honor system. But if the funds were low, emperors were known to cut benefits, delay payouts, make you serve longer. They could do what they wanted, and you didn't have recourse. All you could say was, please pay me or I'll support a coup. And that was just not really, that's not really vesting as we understand it. So no, you didn't really have an enforceable right to this. So changing gears to colonial war pensions, we are going to jump ahead to the 17th century in what would become the modern United States. And we're going to look at a specific person, Pedro Ferdinandos, aka Peter Fernandez, who is my 10th great-grandfather. His original name was almost certainly Pedro Fernandez or something very similar, but British settlers in Maryland just had a very difficult time pronouncing it, difficult time spelling it. So Pedro became Peter, and Fernandez became Ferdinandos or Fernandez or Fernandez, a bunch of different manglings. So we'll just use all of those interchangeably for these purposes. He was almost certainly Portuguese. He arrived in Maryland at 17 years old in either 1668 or 1669, and he served there as an indentured servant for a while. So he was part of the Maryland militia, and he was injured at Susquehannock Fort in about 1675. There you've got a little picture of a different Susquehannock Fort. This one is in Pennsylvania, but there are no pictures of the one in Maryland where he was injured. This one is over 100 miles northeast of the one where he was injured. But he was serving in the militia when he was injured fighting the Susquehanna. So let's take a look at the map of 17th century Maryland. This is Charles County, Maryland. Pedro arrived here 1668 or 69, and then he served as an indentured servant. For reference, this is where Washington, D.C. is today. Obviously, there was no D.C. in the 17th century, but Charles County is on the Potomac just downstream of modern-day D.C. So this is Port Tobacco, the seat of Charles County. It was literally an important Potomac port for tobacco. Tobacco was very important to Maryland's economy at the time. Tobacco was even used as a currency. Wealth in the Chesapeake region was closely tied to your tobacco farmland, the quality of that farmland, but also how close the farmland was to tidewater. If you were close to the tidewater, you could float your tobacco somewhere where it could be sold and shipped. So Port Tobacco as a name was a little bit on the nose. Then in 1693, which again is years after the attack on the fort, Peter bought a farm here, either Arklow or Arklough, not sure which pronunciation. It's south of the Mattawoman Creek, also called St. Thomas Creek. That meant that there was water access to the Potomac from Arklough to float tobacco, so you could take your crop, float it down to Port Tobacco or elsewhere, and sell it and ship it along. So very valuable location. And again, he would not acquire this until years after the Susquehannock Fort. And here is the fort. So you can see it's all very close. And again, Peter did not own Arklough at this time, but he was somewhere in Charles County in 1675. He would have been about 24, 25 years old when he joined the militia. And he would have been somewhere hereabouts in this very small area. So just a quick history of the Susquehanna. They were invited by the Maryland governor to actually settle near the Potomac where they did, and that was less than a year before they were attacked. Pennsylvania colonists would call them Conestoga. Chesapeake colonists preferred to call them Susquehanna. They were generally known to be fierce warriors, but at this time, 1674, they were battered by conflict, both with other native groups and probably also by disease. So they sought refuge in Maryland, and the governor promised them safety and friendship, and then they moved to a fortified encampment near the Potomac to defend themselves. The attack on Susquehannock Fort was a prelude to Bacon's Rebellion in Virginia, which of course is very famous, and you may have heard of it before, but it was essentially poor landless men, white and black, current and former indentured servants, slaves, and freed slaves, who all were participated together in Bacon's Rebellion. They were very upset for a lot of reasons, upset at corruption, but also upset that a lot of the good tobacco land had already been given to cronies of the royal governor, and then remaining valuable farmland was being used and occupied by natives. So they started what is essentially a grassroots ethnic cleansing campaign. Awful, I know, but that's essentially what it was. That's their main goal, was to attack a lot of natives, and they started off with reprisals, supposedly in justification against attacks to get revenge, but often they would attack unrelated, innocent tribes. So they were really just killing all of them. They wanted the land, they needed those people to move, and that was a big part of what was going on. These landless men wanted the land that the Indians were settled on. And in the service of that, they crossed into Maryland. The Maryland militia joined these Virginia landless men, and they besieged Susquehannock at their fort. Pedro Fernandez was there at the fort, Side note, so was John Washington, the great-grandfather of George Washington. Uh, when the militias were outside, 5 Susquehannock chiefs came out to parley for a truce. They were killed as a result of the negotiations for coming out, and that started a weeks-long siege of the fort by the militias. Uh, and then at one point, the Susquehanna broke out of the siege, and they started fighting their way across Maryland and fought their way back into modern-day Pennsylvania. So the Virginia militia after this went back to Jamestown. They confronted the governor. The rebels accused the governor of corruption and siding with natives, and they demanded more aggressive action against the natives. Supposedly this was to protect against attack again, but as I said, probably a big motive was just they wanted the land because a lot of them were landless and didn't have good opportunities for land unless they could push out the natives. And then it escalated. The rebellion escalated until the militia burned down Jamestown, which was the colonial capital of Virginia, in 1676. And a month later, the rebellion collapsed when Bacon died of dysentery, yet another reminder that the past is awful. And by the time the Redcoats arrived from England to put down the rebellion, it was already done, but so was the royal governor. He was dismissed and sent back to England in shame. So back to Peter. Let's forget all of that. At some point in the fracas at the fort, Peter was injured. And in 1683, the Maryland Assembly voted a one-time lump sum, 3,000 pounds of tobacco. They also voted 2,000 pounds to William Shute, who was also injured at the fort. And remember, at this time, tobacco is Maryland currency. So this lump sum probably helped Peter to eventually afford to buy Arcliffe. And then in 1696, the Assembly again voted to give a pension, this time an annual pension, 2,000 pounds of tobacco per year to each, Peter and William. Some sort of disability pension, we never hear exactly what it is. They're never specified what the injuries were, but they did happen at the fort. What's interesting here is it's not just a retirement pension. Nobody else in the militias for Maryland got these pensions. It's just these 2 men who were injured, not the others. So that's an important distinction. This was not just for anybody. This was because of disability. And another interesting thing to note is, what is the incentive here if the promise comes after the service? Are you really encouraging people to sign up if they don't know that there's going to be a pension until much later, years later? It is an interesting question, one that modern pensions try to solve much more systematically, but at the time was very ad hoc. So now we'll just quickly look at the key issues, and we'll focus quickly on Peter Ferdinandos, or Pedro Fernandez. We'll come back to a lot of these issues later in part 2 when we finish up war pensions, but for now, what was the purpose of this pension? Well, probably it was a combination of Peter Fernandez and William Shute. They were injured, possibly disabled, and not able to fully use their physical capacity to earn money. So that would have been part of the reason that maybe they justified getting a pension, but probably also it was just in respect to the service that they performed for the militia that probably had sort of a political or civic element to it that probably encouraged the politicians to look out for these 2 men, and whatever injuries they must have incurred probably were enough that even years and years later they were still apparent, so the Assembly felt they needed to do something. For administration, it's obviously very haphazard. Relative to a modern retirement scheme, it really looks crazy that you would have to go to the legislature, the Maryland Assembly, just to get your pension. You have to get a special bill, a special vote, just to get your pension. That's a pretty crazy way to administer a system. It made sense for a small pension that was very ad hoc. They only had 2 men that were getting a pension off of this, that were getting any sort of disability payment. So that really doesn't need a large system, but it does show how different the administration was when you had to go and essentially talk to your state, your colonial legislature, just to get action. That is not the administration that we would expect from a modern retirement arrangement. For vesting, it does not exactly exist in the sense that the Assembly didn't have to vote either the 1683 or 1696 pensions. It sort of exists in the sense that after the annual pension was voted, Peter and William probably could have claimed that they were due a pension if it had been forgotten. But if the assembly had ever decided, no, we're not going to give that to you anymore, it's likely that would have been upheld. So in a very real sense, it was not enforceably vested. If the politicians had decided to change it, there wasn't much you could do about that. And that links to funding, right? They're paying for it. There's not any sort of trust. It's very ad hoc. It's just these two guys. The most interesting part of that is just that it was paid in tobacco. Very unusual, obviously, but ultimately just the colony's currency at the time. It's actually a very interesting system. If you want to do more reading up on that, I found it very interesting, and I don't want to get any more distracted in this video than we already have, but other than the unconventional use of a commodity to pay a pension, really what this is just your typical paid out of general revenues or the equivalent. No dedicated trust, nothing like that. So obviously Maryland had a lot of the power to pay or withhold. And for fairness, it is an interesting question. You know, why shouldn't anyone else get any payment? But this was how they would have seen it at the time, that serving in the militia was very honorable, but it was probably more your civic duty is what they would have said. This is just something that you owe everybody else, and you owe it to yourself. I mean, this was their neighborhood, so to speak. You saw that map of Charles County. It was a very small area. They probably would have said that they were defending their neighbors and themselves. So it was seen as a civic duty, but being injured, they probably all felt that they had some duty to take care of the injured. So that's probably how they would have analyzed fairness, at least at the time, in the spirit of the time. So we'll look more at key issues as we go along, and we'll loop back at the end of war pensions in the next video. So thanks again for your attention, and I hope to see you in part 2.